Hello. We're going to start a new lecture set, and this one is about binocular stereo. Like with the range data set, which is another one of the video sets, we're going to attempt to recognize some objects, but in this case we're going to use a slightly different kind of data. In particular, we're going to be looking at a pair of images, and from that's going to give us some three-dimensional information. And in this lecture set, we're going to see a little bit about where that three-dimensional information comes from and the stages of the processing that are necessary in order to extract that three-dimensional information. What we're going to use as the ultimate goal, I guess, really is another object recognition system. We're going to try to recognize a wedge. Actually, there's two instances of it. Here's one and here's the other. And in this case, we've got a pair of images that we're going to use from that. And we're going to go from the pair of images, which are essentially two-dimensional, to try to construct a three-dimensional description of what we see in the scene, and then we're going to try to match that three-dimensional work to a model of the object. We'll rehearse that again in a minute. One of the things you might also want to do is you can actually, if you can do cross-eyed stereo or wall-eyed stereo, you can kind of look at these pair of images and actually see the three-dimensional scene if you want. The core of binocular stereo is really to take the pair of images and somehow combine them to produce some sort of three-dimensional description of the scene. We typically have a left camera or a left video camera, a right camera and a right video camera, and they've got to be separated by some kind of a distance, a so-called baseline. And once you've got that, then you can kind of triangulate out from the right camera and the left camera, you can triangulate out to figure out the three-dimensional position. The geometry of this is really straightforward. Here we've sort of seen a sketch of that where we've got, again, the left sensor and the right sensor. And here's our baseline. And from the left sensor, we can see some sort of object represented here sort of schematically by this dot somewhere out in our image. And because we've calibrated our sensor, we can tell that that dot must lie somewhere on this line right here, this ray, because of where we saw it in the image. And from our calibration, we can say, well, it's out at this angle right here. Similarly, from our right sensor, we can do the same sort of calculation, only in this case, the dot's in a different position, and therefore the angle is slightly different. And once we've got those two angles and this baseline, which also comes from calibration, the calculation is really quite straightforward. It's just simple kind of geometry that you can do at school. And from that, we can then calculate the position of this point in the three-dimensional space. Now, why are we interested in this sort of three-dimensional calculation? Well, here we're going to be interested in object recognition and location. And once you have that location, you can get a robot to go in and grasp it if you're doing some kind of sort of machine assembly type work, or spray painting or inserting glue or components or something like that. A robot could also use this for obstacle avoidance, because you can tell where the objects are, the obstacles are in the scene, and therefore navigate around them. So those are some of the kinds of applications that you can do with this sort of stereo type system. Traditionally, there are three stages to a stereo system. We're going to look at all three of those stages sort of in some considerable detail. In fact, we're actually going to build a system that actually does all of this sort of work. The three stages are listed right here. From the scene itself, we're going to extract some kind of features. We'll talk about what these features might be in just a minute, but for the moment, you can just sort of say, well, there'll be the little red lines that we've got right here. So we do this for the left image, and we do this for the right image. Once we've done that for the left and right image, now we have to match up the features between the left and right image. So we want to establish some kind of a correspondence, sort of showed schematically by these arrows right here. And once we've got the paired features, then we can do this kind of triangulation that we've done in this sort of simple geometry. And we can calculate where that feature is in the three-dimensional kind of scene. And we do this for each of the features. And that's what builds you a three-dimensional description of the scene. In our case, we're also going to try and recognize the object. So we're going to do a few extra things on top of that. We're going to kind of analyze and extract some kind of description of features, and then we're going to match those features to a three-dimensional model just like we did with the two-dimensional part recognition system. So the question is really, what sorts of features might you use? Okay, so here that's our first step right here. What sort of features? And there are four kinds of features that people have traditionally used. The first are little sort of edge fragments. Here's a kind of a typical image. It was sort of very commonly used in the early days of image analysis and image processing. And you apply an edge detector to that, and from that edge detector you get a bunch of little fragments that talk about where the brightness in the image has, sort of big contrast. It goes from light to dark, okay? You can see that's where there's a little edge. We'll talk about a very famous Canny edge detector later on in this group of lectures. Another feature that people have traditionally used is sort of very large complete structures, so like complete vertical lines, like I've shown here in this sort of picture of the block, and they will match a couple of these large lines together. Now, of course, most of the world doesn't consist of blocks, but a lot of stereo systems are built for robots that work indoors. And when we work with built architecture, there are straight lines everywhere. That's just the way we build our buildings, okay? So we've got doorways, we've got corners of walls, we've got edges of notice boards, we've got boxes, we've got display panels. All of these things have large vertical edges, and as well as horizontal edges and things like that. And so we can do our stereo on these large features. It has the advantage that there's fewer of them, and also they're sort of more reliable than all of these sort of many little edge fragments that you see right here. The third kind of feature that people match are some kind of what you call interest points, where inside of an image, instead of looking at little bit of edges, you look at little neighborhoods that have some sort of special characteristic to them. And you hope that these characteristics are well defined and sort of unique, and so when you look at two different images, you'll find these little features to match back and forth between the two. And here's sort of like an enlargement of one of these little kind of neighborhood features, and you can kind of see there's a little sort of pattern in there. We'll talk some more about these kinds of features as well, because they're very commonly used for stereo matching systems. And finally, instead of some little subset of the image, you can actually use the image itself. You can use a neighborhood of the pixel values complete with all the colors or just the gray level values. And I've sort of illustrated that right here. So this little neighborhood right here has a whole well-defined set of colors right here, and we can match this little set of colors with this little bit over here, or similarly this little bit of edge right here can match over here, or this little object. In this case, we're looking at a whole little patch of the image data, and we're matching one patch to the other patch. The advantage of this is that there's patches everywhere, and if you had enough sort of structure or texture, one could conceivably do a bit of matching from every bit of the image to every bit of the image, and that will give you lots of three-dimensional description of the scene. This kind of matching with the SIFT features only gives you information for where the matched feature points are. So as you can see in this scene, we've got lots of these little white spots, those are the feature points, but we also have lots of regions in the image where there's no data, no features to match, and that means we're not going to get any three-dimensional information. It's sort of even worse with these sort of edge detectors and these line finders. There's just a few lines, so you only get three-dimensional information at each of those points. So therefore, this, if you can do the matching, works quite well. And we'll look at some of the sensors that give you some of this kind of data as well too. The other thing that I want to mention about is that the humans can do stereo, and we have two eyes, and actually we have a kind of neural processes in the back of our brains that do this sort of stereo calculation. There is a kind of question as to what it is that we use, or what our brains use in order to do this calculation. And the opinion of the sort of neuroanatomists and psychophysicists is that actually our brain sort of works at this kind of level. Okay, the algorithms that we use are probably different than the computer algorithms, but this seems to be the kind of level of data that we work at. This is not true for everyone. Like with many things, our brain sometimes doesn't develop normally, and about 5% of humans don't actually have a working stereo vision system. We still understand the three-dimensional world from lots of other reasons because of, for example, motion or depth cues or something like that. But our stereo system just doesn't work in the same way that about 5% of males are colorblind. All right, so what we're going to look at over the course of this lectures is summarized here. Really, we want to go all the way from the raw images up at this end, all the way down to a recognized object, in this case these little wedges, all the way down at the very bottom of the system right here. And we're going to go through a variety of sort of steps when we're actually building the very stereo vision system. So we're going to look at the canny edge detector, which is a way of finding little edge fragments. We're going to find a way of taking those edge fragments and turning them into longer straight line sections. We're going to do some kind of feature matching between the straight lines to get our correspondences between the left and right image. Once we have those features, we're going to be able to do estimate the three-dimensional position of all of those lines. And with the three-dimensional model and the three-dimensional line position, we can start to do our model matching and our pose estimation that tells us which object is it and where it is. So this is the main theme of this set of lectures, but we're going to have a few distractions along the way, in particular to talk a little bit about edge detection in general, and also to talk a little bit about the SIFT feature point detector. So this is really a bit of just an introduction. It's quite a long introduction, but we've got a couple of important points that we've managed to get across right here. Okay, one of them is that actually we've got a sequence of the kind of core steps that go into a stereo kind of system. It's not just about the triangulation and geometry. It's also about the types of features and how you can match them. Once we've got that matching, we can see that the geometry is really very straightforward. You know, it's just a high school sort of textbook type calculation. The tricky bit is really into the issue of what kind of features and how can you match them together. And one of the things that complicates I guess, sort of the research of computer vision is that there's a variety of different kinds of features that one can use, as we talked about, for actually doing this three-dimensional calculation. And I wouldn't say that the community is entirely settled on which are the right ones to use in which particular application. Anyway, that's all for the introduction. Thank you very much.